Hello and welcome to eFinancialCareers' latest webinar, Championing Inclusive Hiring in Financial Services. My name is Katie Welch and I'll be your host today. Joining me is Simon Mortlock, Content Manager at eFinancialCareers, and Cindy Joseph, Founder and CEO of the Cee Suite, and formerly of Goldman Sachs. Now, before we start, I just wanted to take you through the features of the platform. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a grey toolbar, which will allow you to toggle on and off different features, including the overview of the webinar, resources you can download, the question box, as well as presenter information. You can also tailor your view using the button comprising of 4 squares in the bottom left-hand corner. Please feel free to ask a question at any time. We'll be able to answer these during the Q&A part of the webinar. If there are any we don't have time for, these will be responded to and included in our Q&A write-up, which will be sent out after the webinar, along with a copy of the slides and a link to our Diversity and Inclusion Content Hub, where you can find further resources on this topic. Now I would like to introduce Cindy Joseph, who's going to tell you a little bit about herself. Welcome, Cindy.
Thank you so much, Katie, and thank you for having me, and welcome to everyone watching our Inclusive Hiring webinar. My name again is Cindy Joseph. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the founder and CEO of the Cee Suite. We are a talent management consultancy with a laser focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion in everything that we do for our clients. My background is in talent management. I spent the better part of 2 decades doing a lot of recruiting, diversity, equity, inclusion, performance management, and leadership development in corporate spaces, including 15 years in the finance industry. And I'm excited to be here to talk about a lot of the tips and strategies and tactics that I have learned along the way, as well as taken my clients through as it relates to inclusive hiring.
Great. Thank you very much, Cindy. And now I'll just take you through our agenda today. So we've divided this topic into 5 key stages of the hiring process. And so we'll focus on inclusivity at each stage. We'll start with talent attraction and sourcing before moving on to application and selection, and then on to interviews, and finally focus on the offers stage. As previously mentioned, we will then have a Q&A session. Now, over to Simon.
Thanks very much, Katie. So diversity, equity, and inclusion have been more firmly on the hiring agenda for employers, including those in the finance sector, particularly since the growth of the Black Lives Matter movement in 2020. Now, the finance sector has certainly come a long way when it comes to DEI, but I think it's safe to say it still has a long way to go. In a new poll carried out by eFinancialCareers, an overwhelming 73% of respondents said sourcing a diverse talent pool is important when hiring in financial services. And in-depth qualitative research commissioned by eFinancialCareers found that professionals in the finance sector place a strong value on DEI considerations when job searching. So, Cindy, why do you think this is? What benefits are there for employers in making their hiring processes more inclusive?
Thanks, Simon. To jump right into your question, those findings about candidates in the finance sector placing that strong value on DEI is consistent with other data that we have from organizations like Glassdoor that tell us that job seekers want to work for companies that align with their values. They want to work for companies that are conscious of issues of inequity and are at least trying to promote inclusion and belonging. And the finance industry is really no different. In terms of benefits, we know that diverse teams are high-performing teams. We know this from years of research that's been produced by different organizations, whether it's McKinsey and Deloitte, Harvard Business School, Google, you name it. There have been so many of these studies that tell us just how helpful and useful diversity is when we think about innovation, higher revenues, better ROI, all of these things. And in some cases, these teams even have better retention as well. The thing that often gets lost in the discussion about the benefits of a diverse team is that diversity itself doesn't just magically happen, nor does diversity alone automatically yield the best outcomes. It's inclusion and psychological safety that are the core elements that enable people to show up fully and therefore be able to innovate and excel. So if we want to see the best of our candidates, we really have to consider a process that allows them to showcase their value in the most authentic ways. And that's really where we want to get into some inclusive hiring strategies.
Thanks, Cindy. So it seems like the benefits of inclusive hiring and, as you just said, particularly inclusive working environments can potentially be immense in terms of the aspects you've just mentioned, like, I don't know, team performance, innovation, and retention. But banks and other financial institutions aren't always getting it right because their workforces aren't as diverse as they would like. Why do you think that is? What are some of the challenges that financial services institutions are facing around inclusivity in the hiring process?
When I think about making the hiring process more inclusive, I think any organization that wants to do it right has to anchor to two main priorities. One is widening the sourcing pool so that the candidate pool is more diverse at the outset. And the second is to standardize assessments to mitigate bias. Each industry is going to have their own specific challenges in doing this, but I hear a couple of things from financial institutions that I've worked with. On the sourcing side, I hear that there's a pipeline issue, that there just haven't been enough candidates with underrepresented identities who have certain degrees, or maybe who have attended certain schools, or who have specific experiences that employers can consider. And while there may be some niche and very specific functions where having a narrow set of experiences is critical, I would push back a bit on the pipeline argument and offer that oftentimes candidates are being sourced through the same narrow set of channels. So for example, wanting to go to top rated schools only, or schools that have a strong alumni base within the organization. Referrals, which tend to be so detrimental to representation progress because most of us have relationships with people who have similar lived experiences as we do. Or sometimes we just like to go to our go-to places to find candidates. At the same time, while we're doing all of these things that aren't particularly helpful for inclusive hiring, we know that women are earning more than 50% of the college degrees, and the percentage of people of color with college degrees continue to increase. The talent is absolutely out there. The other thing that I've seen is where a handful of underrepresented candidates will be identified from a source that's deemed to be, high caliber, and multiple companies may be courting a small group of candidates, even though other individuals from less trafficked sources, tend to go untapped, right? So all of this would suggest to me that the issue isn't perhaps pipeline, but that we're often just more comfortable sourcing from familiar places. On the second priority of standardizing assessments, I think a lot of organizations are getting better at this, but I've had clients in the finance space that still bristle over having too much structure in the process. And we know that structure is what allows you to assess candidates completely, fairly, and effectively, and to mitigate bias. So addressing those two gaps, I think, would be a great place to start for any organization looking to improve their inclusive hiring.
Thanks, Cindy. So now we understand some of the challenges. For example, you were just mentioning the narrow sourcing channels. Let's look at some solutions, ways that financial institutions can recruit in a more inclusive manner. And to do this, Cindy has broken down the hiring process into 5 key elements. So let's begin right at the start of the recruitment process, talent attraction. Now, financial institutions have been putting a lot of effort into employer branding and recruitment marketing recently. Many now have standalone employer branding teams. So what are some of the best practices to make employer branding more inclusive?
I think any branding team should consider how their external messaging aligns with the organization's values and goals around diversity. When you consider not only your careers page, but also the broader website, social channels, ads, branding teams at financial services firms can certainly ask themselves a few key questions. So are people of different identities highlighted in their messaging? And are their stories told authentically? Have people from underrepresented groups proactively been tapped to weigh in on the messaging, including the actual copy used, the imagery, and the channels through which that messaging is delivered, right? It's not just about posting on your careers page, if you're not on the radar of your target audience, they're not likely visiting your page if they don't know about you as an organization. So are people of different identity groups weighing in on where the organizations should be even messaging in the first place? Other partner organizations, community organizations, websites, social channels, things of that nature. I would highlight aspects of the company culture that support inclusion. So everything from policies like generous parental leave policies, company benefits and perks, any DEI programs or employee resource groups, aspects of the way that you run your business that factor in diversity, equity, and inclusion, and any partnerships or community allyship efforts that you have in place. And then last, I would also think about what are ways in which the branding team can check that the messaging resonates with their intended audience. And a simple way to do this might be to hold focus groups with new hires to understand what worked and what didn't as they interacted with the brand during the hiring process.
Thanks a lot for those insights, Cindy, particularly around the messaging aspect. Now, successful talent attraction isn't just about reaching a wider audience via branding and marketing. It's also about writing inclusive job descriptions for specific roles. If you're not careful, job descriptions can come across as biased rather than inclusive. How do you ensure that that doesn't happen in job descriptions?
The job description is such an important marketing tool. It not only helps candidates understand what the company is looking for, but it also gives them a sense for what is prioritized within the company and within the position. A mistake that I often see is the tendency to create job descriptions that are just a long wish list of skills and attributes. And I think the intent is to lay out potential skills and hope that some number of candidates will have some number of those skills. Research shows us that this can, in fact, turn women in particular away, who are less likely to apply for a role if they don't meet all of the listed qualifications. Whereas we know that men will likely apply to roles if they meet about 60% of those qualifications. So what does this mean for your inclusive hiring? I would really think critically about what needs to be listed on the job description. I would focus on those must-have skills, which are the skills, the competencies, attributes that are needed day one to ensure that someone can be reasonably set up for success in the role. You may certainly end up brainstorming nice-to-have skills and things of that nature, but I would argue that none of those nice-to-have skills or preferred skills or that extended wish list are necessary for the job description. They should actually stay off the job description if you can help it. They're only going to serve to narrow your candidate pool. The other thing I would be mindful of as you're considering the contents of the job description is resist the urge to think about the person who's vacating the role as the only template for success in that seat. It's certainly fine to consider, what has made other people successful in that position or at your company. And I wouldn't stop there. I'd be thoughtful about what are other ways of potentially achieving similar outcomes that may look different than what the person or people who sat in that seat before maybe brought to the table. The other thing that I would like to offer is that language matters. Candidates will certainly draw conclusions about the workplace from a job description. It's a subtle and sometimes not so subtle way of signaling whether an organization is inclusive and is really putting its best foot forward, its best effort forward, really, in welcoming all people. So I have a few tips to consider in terms of language. And I think we can, we're here at the language slide. Avoid coded phrases that may shine a light on bias for certain personality traits rather than focusing on qualifications. So describing the ideal candidate as outgoing, for example, can be very exclusive. I'll put myself in these shoes. I don't think that I'm the most outgoing person all the time. And throughout my career, I've been able to turn it on when I need to be in front of clients or when I need to be in front of audiences, right? That personality trait has not kept me from being successful. And so I want you to be really mindful of how you use some of these words. I'd also watch out for phrases like sense of urgency or prioritize their work, because those can signal a sense that burnout may be around the corner or that culturally the organization may not prioritize the whole person. When it comes to acronyms, I know that this can be a tough one, but I would encourage you strongly to consider replacing those acronyms with complete phrases or even jargon. Replace those with things that maybe a broader group of people might be able to understand. This can be really helpful for folks who may be qualified or have the ability to take on a role, but maybe they are a career switcher or coming from a different industry. And they may opt out of applying because they're just not familiar with that jargon. Okay, so remember that it's an important priority in inclusive hiring to widen the pool of applicants at the beginning of the process as much as we can. And then the last thing I want to touch on is what you see here on the slide. It's the use of certain words that can discourage groups of people from applying. This can especially impact applications from women who are less likely to apply to roles where the language signals that the environment may be harsh, competitive, or not people-oriented. Interestingly, women may turn away if the language is too hard or aggressive, but there appears to be no harm in gender neutralizing the language and making it more inviting to women, because men will apply regardless. And I recognize here I'm using very binary language as it relates to gender, largely because that's how the research is conducted and presented. But know that the key point here is that gender neutralizing as much as you can is going to serve all groups of people. So tools like Gender Decoder and Textio, there are other tools that you can look for as well. They're going to help you in reviewing your language for inclusivity and giving you guidance on how to make it a bit more open, so you don't have to do it all on your own. What you see here are just some examples of the types of words that are more inviting and may feel more welcoming for all people to apply. But there are many others that you can consider as you write your copy.
Thanks, Cindy. Thanks for sharing those very practical examples, which I think really bring to life the power that inclusive language can play in job descriptions. So just moving on to the next slide and the next stage of the hiring process, sourcing candidates. We'll begin with some of the core traditional channels, such as direct sourcing and job boards. Cindy, how do you think employers can diversify their talent pools via these channels?
Yeah, not all inclusive hiring needs to be a complete overhaul from the ground up. Financial services companies can definitely take a look at what they're already doing, where they're already recruiting, and consider, are there tweaks that they can make to their traditional channels. From a direct sourcing standpoint, many organizations are already tapping into LinkedIn and the recruiter tools that LinkedIn provides, and they're doing Boolean searches for candidates. I think getting actively engaged in some of those LinkedIn groups that support people from underrepresented backgrounds is one way to connect to a wider group of people, wider audience, where you may already be spending your time on that platform. Adding some keywords that might return a broader range of search results to your Boolean results. That's also another tactic. So adding words like the names of organizations that have a higher percentage of Black talent or women or people from the LGBTQ community, for example, those will certainly help diversify the search results that you see. There are also a number of organizations that support underrepresented and marginalized students and professionals. Many of them have been working with firms in the financial services industry for decades. So building genuine and mutually beneficial relationships with these organizations is a great way to expand your reach and to build sourcing pipeline. These organizations often have numerous opportunities to partner with and engage with companies. So it's everything from attending conferences and career fairs to job boards where their members can access various opportunities that you want to post. My advice to you would be to potentially pick a few that your department or your organization can commit to going deep with, and consider building a multi-year strategy with them. I offer multi-year because sometimes you don't see results in the first year or two of working with some of these organizations. You really have to figure out how you build relationships, what works for you and what doesn't. But I would stick with it for a little while and start to notice what works for your organization, what maybe isn't serving your organization. And then as you learn, add additional organizations that you can build relationships with. And you see here some examples of some of those on the slide.
So large financial institutions have been running referral programs for decades, but these aren't necessarily all inclusive. Cindy, could you explain some of the pitfalls of referrals and how to make referrals more inclusive?
Yeah, referrals can be so detrimental to our DEI efforts if we're not careful. Many of us are likely to have relationships with people who have similar lived experiences as we do. And while it may seem like a great idea to engage people who have been pre-vetted or who know someone within the organization, we have to think about who that does not include, who does that exclude, who doesn't have access to certain networks. Referrals end up often perpetuating more of the same within organizations. I'm not sure that getting rid of referral programs altogether is realistic. I do think that done thoughtfully, they can still be a good sourcing channel for organizations without having as big of an impact on the organization's diversity goals. So there are a few things I would consider here. The first is to ensure that once someone has been referred into an organization, they go through the same exact process and assessment as every other candidate. So that includes not revealing to the interviewers that the candidate is a referral and who the referral is from. So this is like going to limit the bias and extra credit that referrals tend to receive in the process. That's number one. I would consider, if you can't eliminate the intake of referrals, in what ways can you create equity and balance in the recruiting process, in other parts of your process. So if you know that referrals, for example, are going to be 30% of your pool, and most of that group are likely to come from overrepresented populations, could you set a goal to have another 30% of your pool come from your diversity partner organizations or from historically Black colleges and universities, or some other channel to offset the impact that referrals may be having in the process? And then the last suggestion I have is that as you advertise or put out a call for referrals within your organization, remind your staff of your DEI goals and encourage them to think about those goals as they're considering who they want to refer into the organization. Offer that this is an opportunity for them to help the organization move closer to their DEI goals. So encourage them to tap into their wider networks, or at least be thoughtful about the mix of candidates who they refer.
Thanks very much for sharing those insights, Cindy. I think we tend to sometimes think of referrals as a driver of diversity, when in fact, if they're not carried out in an inclusive manner, they can actually have the opposite effect. And what about other sourcing methods, such as organic outreach to candidates and also engaging passive candidates? What are your thoughts on those channels?
Yeah. One of the biggest challenges that I hear in the sourcing process is time to fill open roles. By the time a job is open, it goes out to the market. The team often needs that role filled yesterday, and taking the time to cast a really wide net in the market just seems like time that the team doesn't have to spare. So one way to mitigate that is to be out building relationships and networking, even beyond instances where there may be an actual job opening. It does take time, and I fully recognize, I used to be a recruiter. I know recruiters are often jammed with existing open roles, but to the extent that organizations can be mindful of meeting candidates and building those relationships with underrepresented candidates, keeping them warm when there isn't a role open, when one does become available, they may be able to tap into those networks and build a more diverse pipeline much more quickly. Recruiters and hiring managers, they can be doing this by networking online via LinkedIn, offline via conferences and through other networking events. You can engage candidates with informal and informational interviews or introduce them to people who might help them in building their own networks. All of those things will be goodwill that can be helpful when it is time to begin filling a role. And then the final thing I'll add here is that for organizations who are engaging search firms on their behalf, let those search firms know what your goals are as it relates to DEI, and that you're trying to build a more diverse workforce, and make sure that they know it's a priority for them to hand you a diverse mix of candidates.
Thanks, Cindy. So the recruitment journey now moves on to the application and selection for interview stages. What are your recommendations when it comes to online applications?
I'll keep this one pretty brief. I think the more hoops a candidate has to jump through in order to apply for a role, the less likely they're going to do so, especially if they're not familiar with your brand and your value proposition. So I would think about what is critical and important for you to know, and at what point in your application process do you need to have those insights. And then structure your application process and candidate journey accordingly. So, what's the bottom line that you need to know in order to get from a candidate from application to selection? And at the point where a candidate has been selected, what more do you want to know about them? And ask at that point for that information, and so on. As far as the application itself, just make sure it's user-friendly, it's simple, it's quick, easy to use, and that the process is as transparent as you can make it early on in the interviews.
So thanks for those tips around applications. What about the selection process then? Once you've received applications for a job, how do you ensure that your shortlisting is fair and inclusive when you select people for interviews?
As you're selecting candidates, there are some things that you can do to mitigate bias. Firstly, sticking to the criteria, the job-related criteria, those must-have skills that were laid out at the beginning of the process is very important. I would challenge yourself and other colleagues if you suspect that anyone is selecting candidates based on vague criteria, we need someone with presence in this role. The other word I hear a lot in finance is someone who has polish. These are very vague descriptors which can be hard to define and frankly interpreted differently by different people, and often favor who has been in the role beforehand. So I would challenge, if you hear some of those things as candidates are being selected, to just push back on that and ask for some real core skills and more structured criteria. As I mentioned earlier, resist the urge to simply mirror who was in the role previously. There may be other ways that candidates can achieve similar outcomes, and you certainly may have to stretch a little bit to break that cognitive association and set of assumptions that we can often make when we're primed to see success in certain ways, but it's worth it if we're talking about opening up that pool and creating a more diverse environment. Ultimately, the bottom line is keep revisiting those job-related criteria as you decide which candidates to move ahead in the process.
Thanks very much for sharing those tips. I think it's an important point that you made, that recruiters should avoid falling into the trap of choosing people for interviews just because they're similar to the previous person that held the position. So now let's look at one of the most important parts of the hiring process, and that's interviews. It's well documented that interviews can involve bias, whether overt or unconscious. What best practices would you recommend for making interviews more inclusive, starting with interview panels?
Yeah. For a number of reasons, I know it may not be as easy to source a diverse panel of interviewers, but to the extent possible, take a look at who's involved in conducting interviews and ask yourself whose perspective is missing here. Who should weigh in order to make sure that you have considered multiple perspectives and vantage points as you assess the potential of each of your candidates? If you have planned an interview team for a position and it seems everyone is coming from similar identity groups or potentially similar lived experiences, I would take a step back and consider who else can be pulled into the interview process, even if you have to think a little bit beyond your team, if your team is not that diverse, right? You may look at other teams that yours partners with closely to call in more interviewers, or maybe other people within the organization who can interview from a culture and values perspective, but definitely try to get as diverse a interviewer panel as you can.
And how about the way interviews are structured?
I would think about creating a consistent candidate experience so that every candidate has the same opportunity to showcase their skills and talents. If your interview process, for example, is 3 rounds, resist the urge to have a candidate come back for a 4th round to meet more people because maybe one person or a couple people weren't sure. That's an example of where we start to have uneven experiences and frankly uneven outcomes for folks. So I'd be just careful and mindful about that. I would plan to standardize your interview questions. Standardized interviews are those where every candidate for a particular position is asked the same set of questions and usually in the same order as well. Standardized interviews have been shown to be much more effective than unstructured interviews, and they also mitigate bias.
And what about when you're assessing candidates during and also after interviews? Are there ways of improving the assessment criteria there?
Yeah. Ultimately, standardizing interviews is the way to go, right? Determining upfront what's the criteria that's important in terms of skills and qualifications, and then building interview questions around those skills. It's one of the places where I've gotten the most pushback because people often like to use their go-to questions, or they feel it takes the conversational aspect of getting to know a candidate off the table. I'm not sure if people realize just how much bias can influence the process when candidates and interviewers go off on tangents, or one candidate gets a different set of questions than another. I'll share another quick personal story. I once went out for the same job as a friend of mine who happened to be white. The interviewers weren't aware that we were friends or that we were close, but the two of us were comparing our experiences as we went along the process. I learned that one of our interviewers went really, really easy on my friend. And that same person grilled me in my interview. She was really testing my quantitative skills, my metrics ability. This was a long time ago. I will never know why the two of us had such different interviews for the same position. I got the sense that I was being tested to make sure that I could handle the role, and maybe the interviewer felt it was unnecessary to do the same for my friend. As a candidate, it turned me off to that team. It really did. And that is one of the risks that we run when we start to differentiate and give different people different experiences without explanation, by the way. Even setting diversity aside, there's no way that interviewer was able to compare the two of us on the same exact skill set based on the interview she conducted with my friend and with me. So you really want to be mindful that as you're selecting questions for the interviews, you're thinking about how am I going to be able to get the same information, give each candidate the same opportunity to shine, to showcase themselves, and I'll be able to compare candidates more evenly as well. In addition to making sure that the interview questions are standardized, I would challenge yourself to think beyond what many folks have come to believe a successful candidate shows up like. We often take shortcuts by focusing on a person's alma mater or the companies that they've worked for, without considering that not everyone has had the same access to have some of these opportunities. So again, we tend to do these without thinking about it, and it has detrimental impact and unfortunate outcomes for people from marginalized and underrepresented groups. So as you're interviewing, if you're really seeking to build equity in your process, I would evaluate for skills, for behaviors, for outcomes. I would standardize those questions and certainly avoid honing in on experiences that really may be exclusive in terms of access for different folks.
Thanks, Cindy. I think the value of standardizing interview questions is a huge takeaway from all the great advice you've just mentioned there around interviews. So let's talk now about the next stage, the final stage in the hiring process, which is job offers and onboarding. What do you think financial services firms should be doing to promote inclusion within decision-making processes when they're making job offers?
Yeah. As with any other part of the assessment, I would be intentional about how the decision-making process is structured. So consider in advance who's going to be part of the decision-making process, how you're going to ensure that all interviewers have had a chance to weigh in, and make sure that the assessments are based on those must-haves and job-related criteria that were set out at the beginning of the process. One way that you can do this, and this is another place where I know, because especially finance, right? There's so much going on all the time. People are quite busy. It's making sure everyone is completing a scorecard or an evaluation form of some sort that includes those predetermined set of criteria. And as you're making those final calls, diversity, equity, inclusion is certainly not off the table. If you have a situation where a tie needs to be broken, or you have candidates that are seemingly equally qualified, I would absolutely encourage you to consider the candidate who has the most needed skill or adds a unique value to your organization. And this could include lived experiences. People with different lived experiences can bring new perspectives, new ideas, innovation introduce you to new customers or marketplaces that can ultimately support your continued growth as a business and your organization. So I'd absolutely consider it as a potential tiebreaker.
Thanks, Cindy. And finally, there's the onboarding process. I know you're a believer in the concept that onboarding begins at offer stage. Why is that?
Yeah. I think every interaction with a candidate is an opportunity to help them connect more with the firm, its mission, and its people. And oftentimes, relationships and networks are critical components of access and success. And some people just have an easier time of building those relationships and networks because of affinity. So as you think about hiring inclusively, this is another area where you can intentionally and proactively begin to build equity for underrepresented or marginalized people in your organization. So consider, who should they meet with, right? Who do they meet in the interview process? Who else might be a good connection for them? Who can serve as a mentor or a buddy to help them navigate those first few months of joining your organization? And what, if any, information, skills, or tools that might be good for them to have on day one so that they can quickly come up the curve, have some early wins, and begin contributing to your organization?
Cindy, thanks so much for talking us through the entirety of the hiring process, from employer branding to onboarding, and giving us such valuable and detailed advice. I think you've really challenged us to think about the recruitment process in a new light and really look at how we might be currently operating aspects of our recruitment campaigns, especially as the finance industry seeks to improve the hiring of underrepresented candidates. And I'm sure viewers of this webinar will have learned a lot of practical hands-on tips in all 5 stages of the hiring process, whether that's around re-examining referrals or standardizing interview questions to mitigate bias. But we're not ending things just yet, because we have received some additional questions from the audience around this general theme of inclusive hiring. So I'm going to hand you back to Katie now to run through some of the questions that have come in.
Thank you very much, Simon, and thank you also, Cindy. It's really insightful. So we had a couple of questions in. The first one being, how do you ensure checks and balances when recruiting underrepresented candidates?
It's a great question. And I'm unsure exactly what is meant by checks and balances, but I think the goal should be to mitigate as much bias as possible throughout the process. And that means a couple of things. One, having an intentionally structured and standardized process so it's just harder for individuals to go rogue and everyone is on the same page, everyone is getting as fair consideration as possible. And secondly, holding those interviewers accountable to following the policies and practices and procedures that have been set out in order to ensure a fair and equitable process. So this may mean that some people shouldn't be part of the interview team until they've had proper training, or that offers can't be made until scorecards are in, or that a hiring manager loses decision-making privileges if they're not following the agreed upon practices. Those are some ways I think of maybe ensuring some checks and balances and accountability in the process.
Thank you. A second question we've had in is, how is AI or artificial intelligence being used for matching underrepresented candidates?
Yeah, AI is a hot topic. Over the last several years, I've seen AI being used more and more as a tool in talent management, and recruiting is no different. The idea behind using AI in diversity recruiting efforts is to help mitigate human bias. So an AI tool can help to search and match and select candidates based on that job-related criteria that we've been talking about, which can help broaden the diversity of candidates being brought into the pool or selected from a pool. I do think that with AI, we have to be careful, because even though humans may not be selecting the candidates because the tool is, humans do program the AI platforms. And we know plenty of cases where AI can simply replicate or even perpetuate and scale human biases. Several years ago, actually, Amazon had to shut down its AI hiring program that was supposed to be helping the organization mitigate bias in candidate selection. But the platform was using existing profiles of people within the organization who happened to be more men than women. And so the tool was weeding out women from the process. So, AI can be helpful, but it is important to ask questions about what's informing the tool in terms of criteria and matching and selection.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I think we've got time for a couple more. So how should employers ideally measure DEI recruitment outcomes or metrics?
Mm-hmm. Another good question. There are various ways to consider how you measure the impact of recruitment. There's certainly companies that'll put a stake in the ground and they'll say, by 2025, we aim to be 50% women or have 30% of our senior leaders be people of color, which is great. I mean, I think with big targets can give the organization clear directive in terms of where they're headed. But for many reasons, I do want to offer that it can be hard to achieve huge gains in the diversity of the workforce solely through recruiting alone. So it's going to influence some of those bigger metrics and tracking targets that you'll have, but it's not the only thing that impacts that. And I'll come back around to that. I would start by making sure that you have set up your ATS or your applicant tracking system to capture demographic data to the extent candidates are willing to share it with you. And in that way, over time, you can assess where you have problem areas or where you're making progress. Assuming that you're collecting demographic data, I would spend some time understanding the recruiting funnel and what it looks like at every stage of the process, from application to interviews to offer. Are there different groups of people passing through the interviews at the same rates? Ideally, underrepresented candidates aren't lagging behind in their success rates for working through the interview stages. And if you do find differences in the funnel, that's your cue to review that part of the process and consider where can you make it more equitable or more structured. I would certainly not only track the interview process itself, obviously tracking offers, but also acceptance rates. So if you have a disproportionate number of underrepresented candidates that are declining offers, it may signal to you that they don't see alignment in the value proposition for them, or perhaps they're sensing a mismatch in culture or values. Either way, I think you have work to do, but that's really the benefit of being able to track some of these metrics. And then ultimately, recruiting, yes, does have an impact on the overall representation numbers within a company. So I would track the progress of internal demographics. I would track them across departments and across career levels over time, right? We need to dig into all parts of the organization. But recognize that retention and promotion rates also have a significant impact on whether or not an organization moves the needle with diversity. So recruiting should really be one of a number of metrics that are being tracked in this space.
Thanks very much. And just, I think we've got time for one more. How do you standardize interview questions for underrepresented candidates? And is it realistic to ask everyone the same set of questions?
Yeah, again, I think this is where I tend to get a lot of questions and a lot of pushback. So I'll answer the second question first, which is yes, it is absolutely realistic to ask everyone the same set of questions. It does take some thoughtfulness up front and a little bit of practice, but it does work. To standardize interviews, I would think about a few things. So firstly, what are the 4 or 5 or 6 competencies or skills that are truly important for someone to contribute in a role? I would then vet interview questions that can help assess each of those skills or competencies. I would make sure that each interviewer understands going into interviews what they're there to assess, right? So are they assessing the entirety of the candidate's profile, or are they only focused on 1 or 2 skills, as part of the interview team? Either way, they should have their questions selected based on what they're there to assess. And to the extent possible, I would keep the interviewers consistent so that they can ask the same questions of each candidate in a similar way. I know it's not always possible, but where you can, that also helps with mitigating some bias as well. So this doesn't mean that every interview is cookie cutter or has to go the exact same way. I think candidates will bring in their own experiences and responses. You'll want to ask some follow-up questions as well if you're unsure about the details that you have. But the goal should be that every candidate gets asked the same core questions so that you have all the information that you need to make an informed and consistent decision.
Thank you very much, Cindy. That was amazing. Really insightful webinar there. So thank you very much for your time, and thank you also to Simon. I just wanted to also signpost to all our attendees that should they want to put some of Cindy's tips into practice, we are hosting a Women in Tech career event shortly. There's more information to be found in the resources section of the auditorium view. And just another reminder that we will share the slides and the write-up of the Q&A in an email following this event. So thank you very much for your time today, and enjoy the rest of your day.